the bomb. Drop the bomb. We're gonna drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We come to drop the bomb. Drop the bomb.
This is a journey into sound. A journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new values, and a new experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, the star of the show,
LaMarr, Darnell Shields.
You've heard it before. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Sometimes you may feel like that's just a saying, but it is absolutely not. The incredible story that you're going to hear today will show how even horrible tragedies and setbacks can help fuel a drive for success. From Oprah Winfrey's scared childhood to Bill Gates' failed business ventures to Sylvester Stallone's birthing tragedy, and yes, Tom Cruise's abusive father. These people have been through the grinder and came out even better than before. Their stories stress one of the most important lessons of all. Never, ever give up. And what I've learned along my personal journey is that the good things in life go to those who fight through challenges and keep going. Well, today's guest is no different from those famous actors I just mentioned. She is Yvette Pegues, and she is recognized as one of the nation's leading authorities on traumatic brain injury and Arnold Chiari malformation. After walking into brain surgery and never walked back out, she lost opportunity for a fully funded Ivy League college scholarship, Fortune 100 executive engineering career, and the ability to walk on her own. On the other side of the tragedy, she won 3 wheelchair pageant titles with platform to help children age 17 to 17-year-old publish their own books. An active advocacy for global inclusion, recreated career as corporate disability diversity consultant, became published author, purpose coach, professional speaker, and recently returned to graduate school to earn a Doctor of Education degree with the focus on special populations. Yvette Pagues lost the use of her legs, but she has still found a way to rise up, and she has made it her mission to help others do the same. She has become the first woman of color to win the title of Miss Wheelchair. I just want to know, how are you able to do all of this? And sometimes I can't even get my lazy self out of bed. This is the interview I've been waiting for a lifetime when I discovered this woman through a great friend. I would like to welcome Dr. Yvette Pegues to the show. Welcome to Sound Bombing. How are you doing?
Doing just great. How are you, Dr. Shield?
Wow, let me just tell you, that was a mouthful. I could have gone on forever. Just researching you was so much fun. Watching you play golf, watching you on all of these interviews, watching you do your own show, watching you travel outside of the country. I am just amazed, and I'm honored to have you in the Sound Bombing Studios. And so, wow, I don't even know where to begin, because I know the people that are listening like, man, this woman is amazing. She has done some amazing things. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what is an invisible disability? What does that actually mean?
That's a really great question, actually. 4 out of every 6 people in this country alone have a disability, but there's only 15% of them that you can see. In my case, I'm in a wheelchair, so when I roll into a room, it's pretty obvious that I have a physical, apparent, and visible disability, but because I was born with a brain malformation that was only recognized 6 years ago, I also have invisible disabilities, a developmental and an intellectual disability. So to answer your question more clearly, it's a disability that you have, which is medically diagnosed, but it's not visually seen. Depression is an invisible disability. Cancer, mental disabilities, a mental illness, all of those conditions that you may not be able to identify on sight are called invisible disabilities.
So walk me through this. You go to the hospital. Was this just for a typical checkup that you were going to the hospital for?
Actually, it wasn't. I had suffered from headaches, head pain. I didn't really think much of it until I started experiencing paralysis. And at that point, I went into the emergency room to get a better understanding as to why it felt like there was fire literally rushing through my veins, and I was starting to experience paralysis on the right side of my body.
So you walk in, you expect the doctor to check you out and then say, hey, give you a prescription, do some x-rays, send you back home. That wasn't the story. So what happened? What did they say to you when you walked in there and you sat down and went through the traditional paperwork that we all go through when we go through hospitals?
Absolutely. So I walked in, and they
now you walked in on your own, correct? You walked in on your own?
I did.
Okay.
I walked in on my own, and there were several tests that were done after hours, literally, of testing. They thought it was maybe MS. They said, you're too young for a stroke. And finally, because I had some really good IBM insurance, they said, hey, let's run a brain scan. So neurologist came in and ran a brain scan, an MRI, and of course, his next response was don't freak out. So I did exactly that. I freaked out and wanted to know what he had to say next. And he pretty much said, your brain has fallen into your spinal column. And if we do not perform surgery, the pressure, the CSF fluid in your head that's supposed to go into your spinal column and get to different parts of your body can't get past your neck, and it will burst through your skull.
So did you feel pressure on your neck or anything like that, or it was just pressure all over your body?
There was pressure mostly in my head. It didn't feel like a headache. It felt more like a head pressure and head pain. And that really made sense to me, more so after I came to understand that I was born with the condition Arnold-Chiari malformation. Fortunately, it was type 1. There's a total of 4 types, the latter of which are fatal. So fortunately, I didn't have the fatal type, and I had to have surgery. And unlike a brain tumor, it's not something they could go in and take out. It was literally road construction. They had to go in, move some things around. They had to cut through my skull, make, some soft tissue expandable, so that this condition, which is degenerative, I was stuck with it. It would continue to overproduce this fluid in my head, which ultimately can cause pressure in those areas. So it wasn't something he could cure, but something that he could decompress, as is the name of the surgery.
So prior to that, because I had a great time researching you. You loved outdoors. You were very, very active. Let's talk about your life prior to walking into this hospital.
Absolutely. Prior to walking into the hospital, I was a networking and systems engineer for IBM. I was recruited directly out of college. I was working with what we now know as the cloud, pretty much just making large machines talk over long distances. I was making really good money. I was married to another IT nerd. I had 2 great children, and I had just come from Haiti very shortly prior to that, and was living a relatively amazing life. I ran track in school. I was very physically active with my children. I played football, basketball. I rode horses. So I was kind of my husband was kind of the academic parent, and I was more of the physical parent.
Wow. And so, of course, the challenge of it, because you talked about boys. Most of my research is around working with boys, in particular boys of color. And I know boys are very, very active. So you were very, very active with these young men based on what I was reading and talking to other people that knew you. So you were the typical mom. You were doing everything. To hear you say that you were very, very physical. You were doing a lot of those things. And then all of a sudden you walk into this hospital after doing all this great work. You're an engineer, graduated from high school, I believe, at the age of 16, correct?
Correct.
So first generation Haitian, sac passe. We're gonna talk about that. So you got these immigrant roots. So you basically are living this American dream, because I understand Haitian and Latin cultures, in particular Haitian culture, very similar to many African cultures. We want you to go to school, become an engineer, become a doctor, save the world, and then all of a sudden that stopped when you walk through the door. After the doctor said this to you, don't freak out, don't worry, which is kind of insane. Where did you go? Walk us through that. Where did you go after that? Physically or mentally or spiritually?
Well, you know, spiritually, I think I was in shock. Of course, we prayed. The neurologist I was working with tried to medicate the condition. It would literally dry out fluids within my body, hoping that it would affect the fluid in my brain, which in retrospect sounds insane. But we did try a medicinal route. We flew into New York to a Chiari center. So in Great Neck, New York, there is actually a center named after my condition. So quite naturally, we figured that would be the perfect place for me to have this surgery, or at least to get a second opinion. And once I realized that there was really no way around it, I wasn't really mad at God. You know, I had a pretty difficult and abusive childhood. So for the first time ever, I felt like my childhood prepared me for the pain and suffering that I was going through, because as we tried to research the best option, I prayed and I said, you know what, God, my babies are little. I really want to be here for them. But if not, I know where I'll go. So I was ready to, you know, have my life end. If not for those small babies, I would have felt very comfortable just going home.
So talk about that without diving too deep into your childhood, because some of the listeners may be confused with that. So your childhood, you said, sort of prepared you for this tragedy that you were about to face, which was something that was unknown to you. I know you said that, you know, this is sort of passed down through your mom, but let's talk about your childhood as a young person growing up. How did that then prepare you to deal with this other life-threatening challenge?
Ironically, like many children in general and families of color, my dad was no longer in the home after the age of 11. Prior to that, we were a separate home, if you will. My mother and brother were one family. Myself and my father were almost like a totally separate family. And once he did leave, he promised to stay in my life. But the moment he walked out the door, my brother, who was older, significantly older, pretty much threatened my life, because up until that point, I don't believe we were ever properly introduced, if you will. From the moment I was on earth, right? The moment that I was added to this family, I became his enemy. And I think that's something that we do differently now, right? 30, 40 years ago, a new baby comes into the home. The existing child gets to rub mommy's tummy and gets introduced to this new person coming into the home. I don't know if it was because we were foreign or because our parents just didn't believe in that, but I was never properly introduced to the family. It's the only thing I can think of, because I never had a relationship with my brother. We never hugged or kissed or agreed on anything, but I wanted so badly to have a relationship with him. Fast forward 11 years, the moment my dad walked out, which at that point was my protector, he became physically abusive and my mother did nothing about it. Now, let me just say this. After I'd been diagnosed and understood that this was a genetic condition, I was born with it, and it was passed down from my mother to her girl child, me, I realized three things. My mother did not have a diagnosis when she died 2 years prior to my diagnosis. She did not have any medication. She didn't have Jesus, and she didn't have a husband. So I can look back at that period where I was physically abused by everyone else in the household and say to myself, my mother went from a villain to a victor because of the pain that I was now experiencing. And as soon as I heard that this condition was passed down from my mother, I cried for her. because I have to understand that with this pain, had it not been for my husband, had it not been for my faith, had it not been for a diagnosis where I can then be medicated, I would probably be a monster. The pain drove me absolutely crazy.
And so if you had an opportunity to engage your mother, let's just say right now, what are some things that you might ask her, or some questions that have still been tingling inside of your head? Anything you ever thought about, or have you had those conversations in her absence?
I actually have not. I will say that I'm grateful to this day that regardless of whatever she did to me, I never disrespected her. I never raised my voice. She was spoiled rotten. Once I got a job, I made sure she had everything she needed. When IBM relocated me to Atlanta, I left her my home, paid the mortgage. She had an allowance, bought her a car. Her lawn was taken care of. I just loved her as much as I could, to the point of excess, because I wanted so badly to have a relationship with her, much like with my brother growing up. I thought I could buy their love. But I will say that I'm grateful to know that, the very thing I tell my children, right? You never know someone's story. And to find out about her story really opened my heart to the fact that most of what she did was probably out of her control.
And I think that's important for people to understand when we talk about, Yvette, when we talk about forgiveness, people that have hurt us, be it family members or non-family members, when we sort of walk around with that pain, it really has an effect. It really has an effect on us. And I like to hear how you sort of spent that, because again, she showed up in the best way possible, being an immigrant, having different concept of what family life is, being in a new place, a new country. I mean, that thing is important. So when you think about your mom, you think about your dad, because we're going to talk about the successes, but I want people to know sort of, because a lot of times, Yvette, we look at the things that we have. People look at our success, the things that we have, the place where we go. And that's why I was so excited to talk to you, to hear about this pageant. I didn't even know there was a pageant for women in wheelchairs, and you were doing all these things. So I was really excited about that. And so I want people to know, before we get to the success piece, they need to sort of peel that onion back. And when you peel the onion back, there's some tears that are somewhat shed. So since mom and dad was sort of in and out, who were some of the biggest influences on your life? And then what are some of the lessons that they taught you?
I believe, I could not articulate it at the time, but I truly believe that when you're in your formative years, adults can teach you one of two things. They can teach you who to be or who not to be. So even in the case where there was this torrential relationship between my mother and I, she taught me so much. She taught me how not to be. She taught me so much so that even after getting an engineering degree, I pursued an education degree so that I could be a better mom. Had it not been for her, I would have never continued my education, because I was very successful as an engineer. Besides my relationship with her, my father taught me quite a bit. I found out years later that he did make attempts to reach me, and my life was threatened, so he stayed away to preserve my life. So I learned a lot from him, because he was so patient, so kind, such a great listener. And the day he left, he assured me that he wanted to leave years sooner, because the relationship was so difficult for him. But he wanted to wait until I was old enough to recognize that it wasn't my fault, and that I could be mature enough to recognize that this would not break the bond that we had as father and daughter.
So why don't you think why don't people celebrate those pieces of individuals? And because I know you do a lot of coaching with individuals, but to hear you say that, you sort of spent that story about your dad. Why don't the average person celebrate those parts of those individuals? And then just the other part, we say that those things exist, but why don't we lift those things up?
I came into my marriage assuming I was normal. It wasn't until I met my husband's family that I realized that there was abuse in my family, that was not a normal childhood, that not everybody's childhood looked like violence and sexual abuse and mental and emotional abuse. I had nothing to compare my childhood to. And I'm grateful, because ignorance is bliss. Had I known I was being abused, had I had, as much access as most children have today, I may not have respected my mother until her death. right? So for the most part, I don't know that most people can see it, right? It's interesting how the eyes can see so much, but because the eyes are in our heads, they can't see itself, right? And so I was able to learn this from the experience, obviously through prayer and welcoming that opportunity to see myself through the eyes of others. Because had I not, I would continue to bleed on the person that did not cause the cut. And that is usually where a coach comes in. A coach comes in with empathy, not sympathy, and with a listening ear, which is the most incredible form of communication, to see what the individual cannot, who's unemotional in the way that we process their pain. We all have pain, and not to get too deep into it, we all have a different or disability. There are no perfection complexes or perfect people. So if we have one to another being able to look deep and to communicate about things that can be tender, then I think we can learn from each other. And those are skills you obviously have and ones that we can develop to help others.
So to walk us through the moment when you realized that this was going to be your life, that your life that you had prior to walking into this hospital and not walking back the same person that walked in. Walk us to that point where you sort of realized that this was my life and I had to live it the way that God had intended it to be.
It was actually an entire year after the surgery. So I walked in, never walked out, thought it was normal until my post-operative visit, and the neurosurgeon looked at me like, "Why are you dragging in here? Why can't you walk?" And when he realized that I couldn't walk, I went through this battery of tests, and I cried out to God, my Lord and Savior, and said, "You will not leave me like this. I cannot imagine what I've done so wrong and what I've already been through that you would leave me like this." So I spent an entire year in denial. I would not buy any assistive equipment. I had one of those Walmart wheelchairs that were 60 pounds, and my poor husband had to pull it in and out at least 4 to 6 times every single time we went somewhere, to the point where I just didn't go anymore because I didn't want to be a burden on my husband. And just about 12 months later, I was pretty much sitting in my dark corner, and I heard something very clearly say to me, "You won't get what I have for you until you accept where you are." And so I did.
Wow. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because we all had that rock bottom piece, but it's interesting to say that you didn't want to buy you didn't want any of the devices to really support you, because I know I've watched you and you talk about the Jazzy Air chair. What is that thing? Because you are all over. I'm like, for somebody that didn't want any of that stuff, you like the spokesperson for Jazzy Air. It's like if I was the spokesperson for Mercedes and BMW, you are the poster child. So tell us what Jazzy Air is.
The irony of that is the most beautiful conversation that I have with strangers. The Jazzy Air is a power wheelchair that extends up to 12 inches above seating position. And what that does is it puts me at eye level with complete and total strangers. I hold hands with my husband and kiss him on the lips without his having to bend down to reach me. It's an incredible piece of technology that's only been out just over a year. And the purpose, obviously, is for social mobility, specifically so that I can have eye-level conversations. And to be honest, when you are, I'm not even going to generalize this, when I was 2 to 3 feet off the ground and everyone had to look down at me, psychologically, I felt like a 6 to 8-year-old. And I don't think that anyone intentionally spoke to me as if I were one, but I just think behaviorally, when you've got to bend down to have a conversation, there's pity, there's sympathy. Sometimes you're treated like an imbecile. And a lot of that has to do with ignorance. But now that I can be 5'2" again while I'm sitting, to literally stand while I'm sitting, I have much better conversations. I'm so much more approachable. And whether I want to be or not, people want to know what it is I'm rolling on.
I know. I'm looking at the video. I'm like, she done got the pimped out. And I know you in Georgia, so I know how the folks in Georgia roll. You got your Joker pimped out, the fly colors. And then you Jazzy. For those that have never seen Dr. Yvette Pegues, I'm gonna be posting some of her videos on the site soon. Amazing, beautiful sister, beautiful spirit, handsome children, fly husband. You know, and I love that you are sort of changing the game of what people would, you know, that what we call a disability. I call them a different ability have. Because I remember when I was telling you I was doing the work in St. Louis in the special school district, and you and I sat on the phone for a minute. I wish I had the recorder going, but it was just a great conversation. I was sort of taking it all in because this world of work is very, very new to me. And I had to be very, very mindful of how I come in to have these conversations, because I'm talking about around issues around equity and race and things of that nature. And so speaking of that, you know, some people may feel uncomfortable around people with disabilities because they worry they'll say the wrong thing. What advice would you give to them to approach someone with this conversation? So if I see you and I see you in a wheelchair, and I may say, girl, what happened to you? Why are you in a wheelchair? Because, you know, folks can be, you know, our people, they can be real ignorant and try to be, and then other people who sometimes don't look like us, then they try to intellectualize it. And then they even worse than the people from the hood. So what advice would you have to give to those people that may want to have the conversation with those people with those different abilities?
I welcome those conversations. This may not be the same response you'll get from everyone in the disability community, but I approach it differently. I approach it in such a way that allows me to use God, grace, and education. My assumption is that if someone asks me a question, they need an answer. And before I even get to the answer, I love them because God says I must. It's not an option. And I'm obedient. So I love that person. So I come from a position of love, regardless of what they say to me. And I give them the second G, which is grace, to assume that if they knew better, they do better. And the only way to know better is to educate them. That's the education piece of it. And I want that person to leave my presence different than they came. And oh my goodness, the children, please don't stop them from asking questions. I believe that difference is such an important part of living in a world that is changing daily, that if we don't teach our children early about differences, then they will grow up to be adults who remain ignorant of the world around them. So I don't believe that answering that question is a bad thing. I love answering the question. And the Jazzy Air by Pride Mobility opens that door up for me more often than I'm even prepared for. But it's always an incredible conversation to be able to have a talk with someone, whether it's in a grocery store or at one of my speaking engagements. It's my ministry. I'm almost uncomfortable if someone doesn't ask me.
Well, let me just tell you, I got a whole bunch of questions to ask you because I looked at your video. You talked about golfing, skiing. What won't you try? What won't you what won't you say? You like, no, hell to the no. I'm not doing that. What won't you try?
Failing.
Ooh, say that again. What? Homegirl said failing.
Yes, the only thing I won't try is to fail, because circling back to what got me out of bed, yes, it took a year for me to accept it, but 3 to 4 months in, my now oldest son was 7 and brought a note into the home from his teacher asking what she should say when my son asked her if I'm going to die. Again, I am the athlete. My husband is the mathlete. He had never seen me horizontal, period, because they sleep, then I sleep. So seeing me in bed for months on end scared my children. And in that moment, I was on so much medication and I was in so much pain that between the hours of 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon until I put them to bed at 8, I literally tied myself upright in that raggedy Walmart wheelchair so that I would have the appearance of health, so that my children would not suffer from my ego and my fear. And that's why failing is no longer an option.
You know, it's interesting when you painted that picture. I'm about to take you way back. There was a movie out called Terms of Endearment. And as you were describing that, I remember when she was like on her deathbed and her sons came into the room and they were having this conversation because, Dad had kept them away from this illness for such a long time that nobody really helped them prepare to deal with this transition, nor did they give these young men the vocabulary to articulate the feeling of what they were going through. And so to hear you having these conversations with your boys and for them to watch you through this process and for you to even want to create this image that everything was okay. What do they say to you right now? What are their thoughts about you? If I had them, if they were in the studio with us right now, what would they say about Mom?
They would probably say that I'm so much fun and that they love the technology that surrounds me, but they are very much aware that I am Mom. I had to earn that back because shortly after my injury, I was no different than them. I had to get toileted. I had to get clothed. I had to get washed. I had to get transported. So quite naturally, at the age of 5 and 7, they're like, she's just like us. When she needs food, she's got to ask Daddy. When she needs to go somewhere, Daddy's got to pick her up. When she needs to bathe and change her clothes, just like me, she's got to get help. Nurses got to come in. She can't even walk. So, think of it from a child's mind. And that's another reason why I sat up and fell down as many times as I needed to get back up. And that's what I wanted to teach my child. And years later, I could say to them, I refuse to allow you to to give up because I did not set that example for you. Well, and that's where their book came in.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about the book. Let's talk about the process, the title of the book, and what it meant to put that together.
Well, my boys were naturally and painfully bullied in elementary school. Now, again, I was in this very archaic wheelchair. I had a neck brace. I had chest wear that I had to use to keep my back straight. I looked like I'd been hit by a truck. So I had all these devices to keep me upright and while my injuries were healing. So naturally, right, in an effort to earn back my leadership role in the household, I'm showing up at school jacked up, looking crazy. And so the kids would say, why does your mom have wheels? Because my mom has feet. That has to be more normal than your mommy having wheels. These little chocolate chips said, my life is fine. My mother is awesome. What is your problem? Even in that small space, I don't know how they got there, but I did remember praying, God, you can break me, but please don't break my baby. So when they would come back to me and say, well, Mommy, little John or Timmy and, whomever would have these questions made them uncomfortable, how can I tell other people that our life is okay and that Mommy is still important to us? And again, I'm just recovering from a traumatic brain and spinal cord injury. I did not have a voice for 8 months. I was medically mute. So I'm at the point of just recovering. And I, again, as an educator now, I told them to, hey, write it down. Let's talk about the things you want to see Mommy do. The first thing that we did was we created a dream board. And their first dream and requirement for me through rehabilitation was to learn how to make macaroni and cheese again. So I made that my goal. And when we met the mac and cheese, I said, what's next? So as they were giving me goals and I was taking their temperature to see how they felt and how they were developing through this very difficult time, we put those on the board and that became our book. And I asked them, what would you like to call it? And they were like, well, my mommy had brain surgery and I'm okay. And in that book, they were able to talk about the things that they liked. They talked about the things that they didn't like, the things they had to do differently. But at the end of the day, I wanted them to understand you will never look back on your childhood and say you had to take care of your mommy. If there's something that is not an emergency that I ask you to help me with and you choose not to, no is an acceptable answer. So I gave them the freedom to ask questions, get real answers, to touch my stitches, to go to doctor's appointment with me if they chose to. And that turned into a book. And today it's a book by kids, for kids, not just about brain injury, but about adapting and being able to be that small voice that usually hears the problem last from a position of hearing it with everyone else. They were very much included as much as they wanted to.
So you kept them involved. And what I love about your story as well is that you said that you felt like you was not going to be a great mom. So what did you do? You go back to school. Who does this? Let me go back to school, get a degree in early childhood education, while working at home. Again, shout out to IBM for them good IBM benefits. Just let you work at home and then go to school to get a degree to understand what it means to become a mom, to engage in particular. You talking about raising boys of color in schools where bullying, and I love how you name these kids because I know you live in Georgia, so you probably your sons don't have no friends named Tommy and Billy. I know what type of names they got out there in Georgia, and so you probably had some little bougie little kids, and also some hood kids who are saying some cruel things. And it's interesting to see that throughout all of that, you know, from your wheelchair, from your bed, from your house, that you're still empowering these young men to take on this greatness. And also, you know, and shout out to your amazing husband who also, you're going to stop playing your husband talking about I'm the athlete and he's talking about I'm the athlete. He walking around picking your behind up. He got some muscles somewhere. If he's scooping mommy up, he got some muscles somewhere. We may have to put him on a powerlifting team. So I think that that's amazing that you wrote the book, together, that they came up with the title, that you go back to school and you constantly amazing people. So in my research, and you came up with the statement where you said, I lost my IQ, so I focus on my EQ. Now, I know you're a hip hop head like me, so when you say EQ, you ain't talking about equalizer, right? Explain that. Exactly. I lost my IQ, so I focus on my EQ. What does that actually mean?
Well, I'd like to circle back, if I may. As you mentioned, IBM. I literally didn't think I needed much time to raise a child. I'm working these large machines, so when they asked me how long I needed off, I just said, I don't know, a week or two. Fell in love with that little baby's face. They let me work from home, and I was home from 6 weeks to 6 months, and 18 months later is when I finally said, okay, I'll go back to work. And I could not depart my situation with my babies. I felt like I don't know what to do with him now. He's 18 months old. I don't want to let him go. I don't want to put him in anybody's school. He's been with me on conference calls. Everybody knows who he is. I do not feel comfortable putting my child in anyone else's school. So yes, I thought that getting certified in a Montessori pedagogy, that I would be a better mom and use the earth and the land to teach him. It just got crazy. And once I got my certification, they said, Yvette, you might as well just hang out and get your degree. Honestly, in that moment, I didn't want to be like my mother. I thought I was pre-programmed to raise my children the way I was raised. This is pre-injury, so I didn't realize that it was a condition that I couldn't avoid. But I literally, in that moment, said, there's no way I'm going to use the example that I was given to raise my children. So it was out of fear. It was to make sure, again, these boys of color had the best chance to be the best men, because I knew I wasn't raising boys, that they would be men much longer than they would be boys. So thank you for allowing me to speak to that, because I know it's important to you and hopefully to the audience that's listening in.
So when Dr. Pegues is overwhelmed or unfocused or has lost her focus temporarily, what do you do? What do you do? Or what questions do you ask yourself?
Oh, that's good. I know there's a question in the air right now, and I promise I'll get to it. But to answer that question, which I love speaking to, is I obviously pray. I give God the glory. My faith is really important to me. My husband, although he's the head of our household, he supports and involves me in a lot of what we do in the home. But more than anything, at the end of the day, I ask God to show me what he's teaching me in this moment. What do I need to learn? I don't want to take this road again. I don't want to lose the lesson. Show me what I need to learn. And because I'm a lifelong learner, and as simplified as that sounds, I love to learn, even in my pain. I don't mind sitting in my pain for an extended period of time to recognize it, to be able to approach it in such a way that I'm backed by faith. I'm backed by the word of God. I'm backed by the promise that was given to me, but I'm not so oblivious to the lesson that I can't ask that question.
Wow. And so in your work, because I want to sort of jump into your work, because your work is who you are. You know, it's funny. My mom, when I left the classroom, my mom's like, so are you going to work? I'm like, Mom, when I wake up, when I turn on my computer, I pick up the phone, I'm working. And so all the things that you've experienced and all the things you talk about, how does that then carry over into how you serve the people that you work with on a day-to-day basis? From your TV show to doing radio to doing talks across the country. What does that look like in your day-to-day work?
When I couldn't return to IBM because of my brain and spinal cord injury, it had nothing to do with not physically being able to walk, but after writing patents and red books and white papers, I was no longer capable, right? You talk about the difference between EQ and IQ. If I could just speak to that, my IQ dropped about 30 or 40 points. So I'll never again likely be drafted by an Ivy League school because of my IQ, my intellectual quotient, right? My smart. But what happened is I almost became a different person. My emotional intelligence, or in this situation, my EQ, my emotional quotient, shot through the roof. How I connect to people, how I'm able to walk into a room and speak to anyone in such a way that they will respond is a superpower. It's one that I never had before. I was very linear prior to my brain injury, right? Black and white, no gray. Think the first
that's interesting
shift,
being an engineer because right. Engineers typically are not black and white because your mind is like all over the place. You work together as a collective. So to hear you say that yours was very, very linear, that's interesting.
Oh yes, completely. To the point where my love language was acts of service. So when my husband's out there mowing the lawn and doing man stuff, yeah, he's strong. That connected to me. That said love. Ironically, 2 years after my injury, I realized that my love language changed. It's no longer acts of service. It's actually now quality time and physical touch. If my husband held my hand in public prior to my brain injury, I would throw up in my mouth. But post-injury, I can now look back and say, I was afraid. Remember, I ran track. I felt strong. I had this power of presence. But now I'm seated in a wheelchair in a home with 5 entrances and exits, none of which I can get in and out by myself. And I had this recurring fear that someone would break into the house and I would not be able to defend myself. So yes, I had this EQ, overwhelming desire to be held and to be close to my husband. But part of that was driven by the fear of being accosted, of being taken out of my comfort zone by a total stranger. And this to me is something I'm now comfortable talking about. But literally, when we had anyone come to the home to make any repairs, I would ask my husband to move all the wheelchairs or any evidence that there was someone with a disability living in this house so that my home didn't become a bullseye. So that is something that I had to really learn the hard way. And now that I have this overwhelming emotional intelligence that I didn't get until after going to school to become an educator, that is all gray. There is hardly any black or white. There is everything individualized for each and every child in every circumstance and situation. So believe it or not, in retrospect, I was learning that even before my injury. In fact, I feel like had I not encouraged and had my right brain massaged through this educational experience as an educator, I would literally be a vegetable. Because remember, I lost 30% of my IQ and a large part of my left brain knowledge and memory and a lot of different things, executive function. Had that been gone and I didn't have the freshly trained right brain teacher, I would not have anything to fall over to. So it was starting to begin then. And so as I, had to learn again and relearn a lot of different things, I did it with so much more humility. I did it with so much more care and attention. And that made me a better servant leader. And there's a lot of situational leadership there, because you ask the question, how is what you do now professionally part of how you serve? Well, imagine, if you will, a corporate disability and diversity consultant rolling into a room. Let's say that room happens to be a hotel and the common areas are not accessible. I'm going to be the first one to see that. So I decided very early on, instead of complaining, ask for someone in a leadership position and suggest, yes, I understand that there's the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law is what I feel when I come into your building. Your rooms may not be accessible, but if I can't even get into your door, you will lose out on the $8 trillion industry that is disability. And if I'm going to see it, whether I charge somebody to pay me to see it or not, I will see it. So I try to use the things that are part of my life anyway to serve others. In fact, I say all the time, I want to use the worst thing that ever happened to me to be the best thing that ever happened to anyone else. And because post-IBM, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grow up now, because I'm sitting and I have these limited resources. How do I now get back into the workplace with such pain? 101 doctor's appointments per month. I don't have the schedule of a traditional 9-to-5 worker. So I volunteered for about 18 months with state and city organizations and federal organizations that served other people with disabilities. I learned about myself. I had social, feeding in those places, and I became very common to the people who I probably would not have access to otherwise. And as a result of that, people kept asking me to do more and more and more, hence the pageant.
The pageant. Let's talk about the pageant. So who introduced you to the pageant, and what was that process actually like?
So I was contacted because of my community service. My community service started with children on my block, schools within walking distance. I felt that children on the spectrum, whether they had Asperger's or autism at the time, were very much similar to my social limitations. I think I kind of selfishly did it for me, but working with children who were on the spectrum fed me. So I loved working with that people group and helping them to socially grow into citizens that would make them and the people who love them proud. And so the call I received from the Miss Wheelchair organization was about community service. I was told, this isn't a beauty pageant. Your talent is your community service. And here's the kicker. Wouldn't you want to help children beyond your zip code? Why not the state of Georgia? Who knows? If you win the national pageant, you can help children much like the ones you help today around the country. That's what got me, because initially I said, absolutely not. I am an engineer. I wear blue, black, and brown. I don't like pink. You cannot get me in any crown, and I do not wear makeup.
Now, you know your friend Adair is going to be hot that you said that you don't like pink. Shout out to the AK. You know I had to throw that out there, right?
Well, that's okay. That's okay, because the extended pause is supposed to do exactly what you just did, because everything I have is pink. I've had 3 pageants, 3 crowns, and I am just the girly girl my mother always wanted me to be. I embraced the beauty of who I was. And let me just say something, Dr. LaMarr. Looking back, as a child, I was told I could be one of 2 things. I could be pretty or I could be smart, but not both. So I chose to be smart. Pretty wasn't an option for me. So after the injury, and I felt like my executive function was taken away from me, everybody kept telling me I was pretty. And while it was meant as a compliment, I kept going back to that record player that says you can't be both. So rather than hearing that you are pretty and it's okay to be beautiful, I heard you're not that smart. So when I was approached to do this pageant, I felt it was beneath me. I'm smart. But when I understood the community service was my talent because I couldn't sing and probably wouldn't dance, I was excited to try it. And so I became Miss Georgia, and I went on from there. I went to the national pageant, and when they called my name, those tears were real. Those were tears of amazement. I didn't plan to win, but when I rolled into that room and saw women from other states who had won their state title looking absolutely fabulous, for the first time I said, you know what? The image of disability is sweatsuits and sneakers. This moment changed it in my eyes, and I will take this to change it in the eyes of others.
Wow. So prior to being in the pageant, had you heard of this type of pageant before?
Absolutely not. I had never heard of it. And it wasn't until after I started to study and learn more that I realized out of 4,000 plus Miss Pageants, there were only 2 nationally recognized pageants for women in wheelchairs.
I love your platform, what you're doing, because again, this is a population of people who don't get their voices heard. And then when you talk about, other thing is being a woman of color, and I'm sure you have stories about being a woman of color also being discriminated against because of your different ability or your disability. What has that been like?
Oh my gosh, I wanted so badly to say that because after winning the pageant, I became the first woman of color to ever win, the first woman of color and the first Georgian to ever win the national title. Now, the organization that I won the title with was 18 years old. The only other organization that has a pageant for women in wheelchairs was 40 years old. That was almost 5 years ago, and there still hasn't been another woman of color to win the national pageant. So for me, it was historical, but it's also a little bit disconcerting. And I've coached other women of color so that they can break that chain. And I feel like my discrimination now is just ignorance, really, because I still have, as a woman of color with a disability, this wall. And that to me is one of the other reasons why I returned to school to get my PhD, mostly because I was on my way to do it anyway prior to the injury. And I was so tired of telling the story at the current end and not the end God had for me. I always felt like, well, gosh, I hate telling the story and talking about all that I've lost. And now that seminary was an option, I feel like that was God's Harvard, right? And to get into those doors, the assumption is that I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I'm in a chair, I can't talk, I can't communicate, I can't function. And yes, it's harder, but it's not impossible. Even crossing the street when I was trying to use a walker, people would like speed up. And I just really didn't understand why people would slam doors in my face. And some of them had handicap tags in their vehicle. And I had to stop and say, maybe it's someone that they love, who they lost. Maybe it's because I'm a woman. Maybe it's because I'm a woman of color. Maybe it's because I have a disability. But at the end of the day, I had to stop maybeing myself and the situation and start loving on them, because it's an indicator that there's something missing, right? There's a deficit. And the only thing that can cure darkness is light and love. So I had to really get out of that mindset of what's wrong with me and recognize that something's wrong with them. And had they been under visible attack, I would help them. But again, you talk about invisible disabilities. If they're under an invisible attack, whether it's spiritual, emotional, mental, I have to help them. And so I had to get out of that place. But to be honest, discrimination is everywhere. I see it, I hear it, I feel it. It hurts. I pray about it. But, I can tell you 101 stories about how being a woman, being Black, and now having all three makes me feel like if I say the sky is blue as a woman of color with a disability, I will be questioned. If I say as a woman with a disability and a PhD that the sky is blue, I may get some attention. But here again, go ahead.
So how do we circumvent that? How do we sort of get around that particular issue? Do we go around it? Do we go through it? Do we just put the hazard lights on and don't move? How do we help people move beyond what you just mentioned?
We have to grow through it. I don't go through anything. I grow through everything because I don't want to look back 5, 10 years or minutes from now and be the same as I was at that time. I would only have to tell an individual if they have that question for me is, what are your goals, right? Somebody can, take away your confidence, but they can't take away your calling. So to recognize that you have a purpose and that you cannot be distracted, especially by darkness, is the only option there is. You can scream, you can yell. I believe in human rights, right? If you believe in human rights, then it doesn't have to be women's rights, and it doesn't have to be disability rights. It doesn't have to be choice rights. It's treating every single individual as a human being. You can hate the sin and love the sinner, to say it in a more biblical way. But I think everybody deserves my love, my time, my respect, my understanding. And I can only teach what I know, what I've done, and what I believe. And that's truly 3 things, like I tell my boys. If you're being accosted, there's 3 Ds, right? There's distance. Put as much distance between yourself and that person as possible. Then there's discipline. If you can't get away from that individual, find someone in authority to help you. If you can't find someone in authority, the 3rd D is defense. I got boys. Defend yourself just long enough to start over again and put distance between you, right? Then, the other Ds come in, but do just enough to protect yourself, to help others. And as crazy as that sounds, my children know I haven't done the 3 Ds, mommy. So let's try this again. And that usually applies to everything.
Well, congratulations on that. Just on everything that you've been doing. You've been such an inspiration to our listeners in the bomb shelter that are tuning in to the show and that will continuously tune in. I'm telling you guys, listen, you need to go online, Google this woman. Her story is amazing. We're going to give you her contact information shortly. But this is the favorite part of my show, Yvette. I call it the super bomb questions. Our show, sound bombing, is about a healing. The word bomb is about a healing because you read scripture. There's this bomb in Gilead. When I was a kid, I thought they was blowing folks up. I'm like, a bomb? I didn't even know what the bomb they were talking about. And nobody really, it's one of those things that nobody really explained to you when you were going to church. You'd be like, oh, okay, you just say that. So, words are powerful. And I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And so this is the part of the show that I love. So I'm going to throw out a couple of questions to you. And I don't want you to give it too much thought, but I want you to respond to it as quickly as possible, as soon as the answer comes to you. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. First question. What is your favorite word?
Entitled.
Entitled. What is an unusual habit or an observed thing that you love to do?
Cook.
Cook. All right. What sound or noise do you love?
Laughter.
What's your superpower or what's your spirit animal? So let's start with the superpower. You did mention that earlier, but what's your superpower?
Communication.
And what's your spirit animal or your animal spirit?
Butterfly.
Butterfly. Okay. All right. Okay. So what is the one book or books you've given most as a gift and why?
The Bible.
The Bible.
Because it's the truth.
Okay. All right. So how can people get in contact with Dr. Pegues?
Well, I have a website. It's www.yvettepegues.com. Obviously, as you mentioned, I can just as easily be Googled. My office number is 844-480-0081. I am Yvette Pegues on all social media platforms, which includes Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn.
Final question for the evening before we shut down. In the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your life?
I think completion and restoration. And what I mean by that is everything that seems to have been taken away has been restored in such a way that I would not have personally looked for in my life prior to my injury. And I have done so much more ministry sitting than I ever did standing. And I love to be able to stand tall while sitting. And I don't know that I would have believed that could be possible had I not had this experience and opportunity.
Well, Miss Yvette, I would thank you for joining me in the bomb shelter. It's been great talking with you. You've truly blessed me and my listeners. I wish you much success. I would also like to thank my producer, Darius Wilmore and Supremacy, for our theme music, and to all my amazing listeners out there. And as always, believe that something wonderful is about to happen and that some people miss the message because they're too busy looking for the mess. Thanks for tuning in, and do something positive for someone other than yourself today. You've been listening to Sound Bombing.